Often when we tell the Beatles story, we focus on John, Paul, George, and Ringo, and maybe don't spend as much time talking about two other people who played a big role in the Beatles' music and career success: Brian Epstein, their manager, and George Martin, the producer. Last week we talked a bit about them as well. So I want to update this week, update into 1964, what's happening in the careers of these two crucial figures in the Beatles' careers and music. Let's start with talk about Brian Epstein. As you know, as I said last week, that name is pronounced either Epstein or Epstein. I do it interchangeably now, but it turns out that he preferred Epstein. Most people say Epstein, so forgive me if I keep lapsing back and forth in these lectures. Anyway, Brian Epstein's big sort of rival, but also mentor, the person he sort of modeled himself on. Larry Parnes was the guy. I don't think he was exactly Brian Epstein's mentor as much as he was somebody who Brian Epstein wanted to be like. And we've talked a bit about Larry Parnes and all of the artists he had coming out of the 1950s and in the beginning into the 1960s, a whole sort of roster of pop songs, pop singers with those fantastic names. And he was, Larry Parnes, in many ways, one of the most important and powerful figures in British popular music in the period before the Beatles. Brian Epstein had personal contact with Larry Parnes. There's even a story that Brian Epstein might have even gone to work for Larry Parnes at a certain particular point very early in his career before the Beatles thing began to take off the way that it did. And so it's very clear, whatever the story about that is, that Brian Epstein was very aware of Larry Parnes, what he'd done, what his accomplishments were, and very much wanted to do a similar kind of thing, or even outdo Larry Parnes, be even bigger than Larry Parnes had been. And in many ways, he achieved exactly that during this period, 1964 into 65 and 66. He had a roster of stars like Larry Parnes. And here are some of the stars that didn't quite make it, that he managed at the time. Of course, the biggest ones would have been the Beatles, Jerry and the Pacemakers, Cilla Black, whose original name was Cilla White, but he changed it to Cilla Black, Billy J. Kramer, the Big Three, the Paramounts, Sounds Incorporated, Paddy Clowes and Gibson, Tommy Quickly, a group from the U.S. called Circle, and a group called The Foremost. That it doesn't exhaust all of the Brian Epstein acts that he gathered around himself in 1964, into 63, 64, 65, as he began to create this fantastic agency, talent agency that became one of the biggest agencies certainly in the UK and in the popular music business, largely on the success of people like the Beatles, Cilla Black, and Jerry and the Pacemakers. Talking for a minute about Jerry and the Pacemakers, here's a group that had actually ended up having the hit with the song "How Do You Do It." You may recall the story about "Please Please Me" when the Beatles came in with "Please Please Me." George Martin wanted them to record "How Do You Do It," a song written by a professional songwriter by the name of Mitch Murray. And the Beatles did it, but didn't like it. And George Martin said, well, if you can come in with a song that's as good as that one, we'll do that one. So the new version of Please Please Me, the one that went to #1, is the one the Beatles did. George Martin, promptly producing Jerry and the Pacemakers, took the song from the Beatles and gave it to Jerry and the Pacemakers, and guess what? They had a #1 hit with it. They followed with another Mitch Murray hit called I Like It. And then Jerry Marsden, the lead singer of the group, did an awful lot of songwriting, either by himself or with other guys in the group, and had hits with songs that came from his own pen, including Ferry Cross the Mersey, It's Gonna Be All Right, and Don't Let the Sun Catch You Crying. A lot of these other Brian Epstein groups did songs written by John Lennon and Paul McCartney, either specifically for the artist or ones that they wrote but didn't want to use for the Beatles or whatever it was. So if you want to go looking for Lennon and McCartney songs that were never recorded by the Beatles, here are some to go look for. Cilla Black's Love of the Love, Love of the Loved, and It's For You. Billy J. Kramer's I'll Keep You Satisfied and Bad to Me. And you could go looking for The Foremost and their versions of Hello Little Girl and I'm in Love. There are actually even more of these Lennon McCartney songs never recorded by Lennon McCartney, or never recorded and released versions by the Beatles to look at. So Brian Epstein builds this fantastic talent agency. He gets involved in the publishing end of it. We mentioned before a guy by the name of Dick James. He often had a publishing piece of a lot of this Brian Epstein music. A lot of these groups were produced by George Martin, so you had a kind of a small group of people who were controlling a lot of what was happening in this music, and much of it fueled by all the money the Beatles were making, which is kind of what kept the project going. But Brian branched off into a couple of different areas besides that. He bought a place called the Seville Theater, or leased it, from 1965, and was still owned at the time of his death in 1967. The family relinquished it in '69. They would do Sunday night rock shows. In fact, I believe the famous Jimi Hendrix show where he does Sgt. Pepper was done on a Sunday night after the release of Sgt. Pepper in June of 1967. But there was nothing else to do on Sunday night in London, so you get a lot of famous people would show up for these Brian Epstein shows at the Seville Theater. Eric Clapton, the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, people like that, Jeff Beck would show up for these things. So it was a kind of a be and be seen kind of thing there. He got involved in theater productions, including James Baldwin's The Amen Corner and On the Level. Remember that Brian had a background in musical theater, or in theater, from before he started working with the Beatles. He produced a show called A Smashing Day at the New Arts Theater Club, and then, interesting, became a celebrity in his own right for a brief period of time when he appeared on the NBC television show Hullabaloo as their kind of British pop correspondent. And so you could begin to see Brian Epstein coming out of the shadows and sort of becoming his own man as a celebrity, getting his own fan mail and being mobbed by fans as he got out of his limousine for restaurants in important places like New York and London. And so in many ways, we could say that if Larry Parnes had been his model and his rival, sometime in the mid-1960s, Brian Epstein had surpassed Larry Parnes. We turn now to George Martin, and if we want to talk about a rival or a model for George Martin, probably the guy to think about is one of the other producers at EMI during this time, Norrie Paramore. Now, you may remember me telling you last week that Norrie Paramore was responsible for Cliff Richard and all of these Cliff Richard hits. And just a few videos ago this week, I got done was telling you how many hits Cliff Richard had during this period of time. What was it, 27 or something like that? An enormous amount. Norrie Paramore was the guy behind all that. So when the Beatles were coming in and recording, George Martin was coming in hoping he would have some success with the Beatles in 1963, but he had to put up with Norrie, who had years worth of top hits with Cliff Richard, and still, I think in many ways, George Martin felt like wasn't taking him very seriously. Well, all that began to change in 1963, 1964, into 1965, as George Martin produced the Beatles, Jerry and the Pacemakers, Cilla Black, Billy J. Kramer, the foremost. I mean, when you think of it, Beatles having all that success, they had to find time to come into the studio to record. So there was only a limited amount of time that George Martin could possibly even spend with the Beatles. And since he was a label head and, needed to go into work every day and have something to do, he had lots of other recordings going on. So he was working with Brian's groups, he was working with other acts, and so he was beginning to become one of the most successful producers of the time. What was ironic about it, however, and you will find these complaints with anybody writing about their time with EMI during this period of time. They characterized EMI as being extremely stingy, the facilities as being not very good, them being very, very tied up with protocol and who would touch which machines and who was going to be allowed to do what, and all this kind of very sort of formal kind of routines about how things would go, that even the Beatles felt was enormously constraining, and they many times they wished they didn't have to record at EMI at all. Well, how this fits into our story is that during this period of 1963, 64, 65, George Martin was not only having all these hits with the Beatles, but he was having hits, especially in the UK, with all these other acts as well. In fact, in one of those years, I think there's an amazing fact that out of 52 weeks, George Martin had a #1 hit 32 weeks out of that. I mean, with one of these different groups, It's fantastic. The guy was at the top of the game and all of that. And what ended up happening is he didn't have any kind of financial piece of the success. He was basically employed by the label to do these recordings for them. And so Brian Epstein could make a lot of money on the Beatles. Dick James, the publisher, could make a lot of money on the Beatles. The Beatles themselves could make a lot of money, although that they should have maybe made more is a question that often comes up in discussion of Brian Epstein, especially with regard to the merchandising of material, you know, lunchboxes, wigs, T-shirts, that kind of thing. But nevertheless, everybody was making money but George Martin. In fact, he got a promotion at EMI because of his great success, but because the promotion, because he had now moved to a different category of employee at EMI, he no longer got a Christmas bonus. So ironically, on the first year in which one of the big years in which he had all this success with all these acts, he didn't even get a Christmas bonus out of EMI. Well, he just felt like enough is enough. So he, in August of 1965, formed an independent producing co-op with a couple of other producers called Associated Independent Recording, or what's often referred to as AIR Studios, A-I-R, AIR Studios. He pulled together some of the younger people that he knew in the business. John Burgess had worked with Norman Newell, another producer at EMI. Ron Richards had worked with George Martin himself, and Peter Sullivan had worked with Walter Ridley at EMI. And the four of them left their jobs at EMI and started renting themselves out back to EMI, but they kept a percentage of profits and this kind of thing. So by doing this, it allowed them to share in some of the profit that was being made from all of these recordings and be able to still use the EMI studios and everything that they had available to them before, but under a different kind of contracting system that made money for EMI and made money for them as well. So he really, by the fall of 1965, for all intents and purposes, George Martin was an independent producer producing the Beatles. Well, by the end of 1964 into 1965, I think it's fair to say that the Beatles had become one of the most successful pop acts coming out of the UK that there ever was. In fact, they were at the top of the game worldwide. Brian Epstein had surpassed Larry Parnes, and George Martin had surpassed Norrie Paramore. So we have a team of people who all set out to sort of be world beaters, and in their own way came to the very top by the end of 1964 into 1965. Next week, we'll take a look at what happened in 1965 and the two important albums and another movie that came along in 1965, Help and Rubber Soul.